When a bridge collapses, right, investigators can usually point to a single physical point of failure.
Right, like a rusted rivet or something.
Exactly. A rusted rivet, or maybe a stress fracture in a steel beam, or, some miscalculation in the load-bearing concrete. It's tangible.
Yeah, you can touch it.
Right. The pressure builds, the material gives way, the whole structure falls, and engineers can literally point to the wreckage and say, there, that is the exact mechanism of failure. It's tragic, obviously, but it follows the laws of physics. It makes a grin kind of sense.
Well, yeah, because we understand physical cause and effect. We can see it, we can measure it, and ultimately, we can rebuild stronger to prevent it from happening again. It offers a clear path to a solution.
But when we look at human disasters, and specifically the uniquely modern, uniquely devastating phenomena of a mass shooting, that investigative logic seems to just, evaporate. Right. Suddenly we're looking at a landscape that feels completely senseless. It's incredibly dark. It's intensely emotional. And frankly, the root causes just feel terrifyingly murky.
I mean, it's the equivalent trying to map a psychological fracture, right? The pressure building up inside a human mind is invisible. It's totally invisible until the exact moment it causes a catastrophic break.
Wow. Yeah.
And mapping those internal fractures requires a completely different set of tools than finding a rusted rivet.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are tackling a topic today that is undeniably heavy, but is also one of the most vital things we can possibly unpack for you.
Absolutely essential.
We're going to look really closely at a comprehensive dossier from Psychology Today. And this dossier examines the actual documented psychology behind mass shootings. Our mission here, for you listening, is not to just marinate in the horror of the news cycle.
No, we get enough of that.
Exactly. The goal here is to empower you. We want to decode the why behind these relentless headlines so you can actually understand the mechanics of what is happening. And, even more importantly, learn how to protect your own mental health and guide your families through this reality.
And that shift, from reaction to understanding is just so critical because when we only react to the immediate shock of the headlines, we miss the underlying mechanisms at play. We really have to look at the clinical data to find any semblance of clarity.
We do. And before we dive into that data, I really want to set a very clear ground rule for this conversation. Gun violence is obviously one of the most politically charged issues of our time.
Oh, without a doubt.
You have deeply held, intensely passionate viewpoints across the entire political spectrum. But the political shouting match rarely actually helps us understand the human behavior at the center of this.
It usually just obscures it, really.
Right. So today, we are stepping entirely out of the political crossfire. Neither of us is taking a side. We're not endorsing a viewpoint, and we're absolutely not pushing a legislative agenda.
Right.
We are strictly acting as impartial guides. We're looking solely at the psychological research and the clinical coping strategies presented in the source material. We just want to understand the psychology.
And honestly, the sheer volume of these events demands that level of objective clinical scrutiny. We have to look at the reality of the numbers.
Yeah, the numbers. To ground us in why this specific deep dive is so necessary right now, let's look at the baseline statistics the dossier pulled from the Gun Violence Archive.
These are tough to hear.
They really are. Between the years 2014 and 2021, the United States saw 3,388 mass shootings.
Wow.
Yeah. And if you zoom in on just 1 year, 2022, between January and mid-June alone, there were 267.
I mean, the human brain isn't built to process numbers like that without short-circuiting.
It really isn't.
It quickly just becomes this blur of statistics, which breeds, apathy or just overwhelming anxiety. So to start processing this, we first need to clearly define the terminology. Like, what is the actual clinical boundary of the events we're analyzing today?
Okay, let's unpack this, because the word gets thrown around constantly in the media. What officially constitutes a mass murder in the eyes of the people who study it for a living?
So, clinically, and from a law enforcement perspective, a mass murder is defined as an event involving 4 or more unlawful killings, and they have to occur in a single event and at a single location.
4 or more, single location.
All right. The defining characteristic is that concentrated, simultaneous burst of just devastating impact.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize the psychology behind that kind of concentrated event compared to, other types of violence. If a mass shooter is like a dam instantly breaking, a sudden catastrophic release of destructive energy all at once, is a serial killer more like a slow, toxic leak in the plumbing?
That is actually a really great analogy. The FBI's behavioral analysis hinges on a very similar mechanical distinction.
Really?
Yeah, they look for what's called a cooling off period. A serial killer operates on a timeline, they commit a murder, and then they retreat.
Like they hide.
Exactly. They literally cool off. They blend back into their daily lives. They manage their psychological urges for a while, and eventually the pressure builds back up and they strike again. It's cyclical.
But the dam breaking means all the water is gone at once. There is no cooling off because there's no aftermath for the person who did it.
Right. The ultimate goal of the perpetrator is fundamentally different. Serial killers generally want to evade capture, right? Because they want to continue their behavior.
Right, they want to keep going.
But mass murderers, however, are frequently operating from a place of absolute desperation and fatalism. It is a terminal act.
Meaning they are fully aware this is the end of the line for them.
Yes. The research indicates they have absolutely no intention of surviving. It's framed in their minds as this final act of vengeance against the society they feel has deeply wronged them.
Wow.
They anticipate being killed by law enforcement, or they plan to end their own lives as the final step of the event. There is no plan for tomorrow.
Okay, but if they know they aren't going to survive, right? If they know this is basically a suicide mission, why do it at all? Like, what possible benefit does the human brain calculate in that scenario?
That's the core question, isn't it? We have to look at how violence functions as a desperately twisted mechanism for fulfilling basic human needs.
Right.
The research shows that extreme violence often stems from fundamental psychological needs going consistently deeply unmet over a really long period.
Unmet needs.
Right. Imagine a person whose life is just unraveling. They feel totally thwarted in their career, their relationships are failing, their daily existence just feels humiliating.
So the pressure is building, but they don't have a release valve.
Exactly. And the source outlines 5 specific psychological needs that cascade into violence when they are thwarted.
What's the first one?
It usually starts with a failure of goal attainment.
Goal attainment.
Yeah. Every human needs to feel they have some agency, some control over the trajectory of their life. When an individual internalizes the belief that they have zero control and that success is permanently out of reach, violence becomes a horrific, immediate shortcut to asserting dominance over their environment.
Wow. So if I can't control my own life, I will take absolute violent control over yours. That is chilling.
It is. And that desire for a shortcut feeds directly into the second unmet need, which is a demand for instant gratification.
Because fixing a life takes time.
Rebuilding a failed life, learning new skills, repairing broken relationships, that requires immense time, patience, and resilience. A shooting, however, alters reality instantaneously.
Right. But why outward violence? I mean, if someone's life falls apart, a normal response might be depression or just withdrawing. Why does it calcify into a desire to hurt others?
That is where the third factor comes in, a profound lack of emotional intelligence. This is the critical mechanism. When a healthy person experiences profound rejection or failure, they have emotional tools to process that pain.
They vent to a friend, or they seek therapy, or they just rationalize it.
Exactly. But without those tools, the psychological pain metastasizes. They literally cannot self-soothe, so the brain turns that internal agony outward into blame.
Which leads to them feeling like society owes them something, I'm guessing.
You hit the nail on the head. The clinical term for that warped mechanism is a failure of social reciprocity. That's the fourth need.
Social reciprocity.
Yep.
A give and take.
Normally, social reciprocity is the glue of society. I treat you with respect, you treat me with respect. But for these individuals, it mutates into a desire for cosmic payback.
Cosmic payback.
Yeah. They feel maligned, ignored, and humiliated by the world. They actually believe they must correct that perceived inequity by balancing the scales violently.
Like, you ignored my pain, so I will make you feel it.
Exactly.
And I imagine that ties into the final need that Dossier mentions, which is this desperate craving to just be seen.
Yes, recognition of competence. That's the fifth one.
Competence.
Competence is how we earn respect in a functioning society. You work hard, you achieve something, people respect you. These perpetrators are overwhelmingly described as loners who experience zero respect in their daily lives.
So they skip the hard work?
Committing a horrific, highly visible crime bypasses the difficult work of actually earning respect. It violently demands global attention and infamy.
When you look at that cascade, someone who feels powerless, lacks the emotional tools to handle it, demands an instant fix, wants twisted payback, and craves global infamy, It aligns almost perfectly with the profile we always hear about in the media, right? The lone wolf.
It does. Researchers actually see a recurring cluster of characteristics in these isolated individuals. The profile often includes chronic vocational problems, severe difficulty sustaining intimate relationships, extreme social awkwardness, a pattern of aggressive or violent communication, and interestingly, they often possess high intelligence.
High intelligent. But wait, I have to push back here for a second because this feels incredibly contradictory to me.
How so?
We just listed a cascade of severe psychological failures. If someone's brain is working this way, doesn't that inherently mean this is just a massive mental health crisis? Isn't the mechanism just a failure to get these people psychiatric help?
You know, that is the most common assumption society makes, but the clinical data dismantles that narrative almost entirely.
Really?
Yeah, while mental illness is constantly blamed in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy, rigorous research consistently demonstrates a remarkably weak link between mass shootings and severe mental illness.
I just don't understand how that is possible. The acts themselves are so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior. How can you commit an act like that and not be clinically mentally ill?
Because we are confusing a morally horrific action with a clinical psychiatric diagnosis, it is vital to understand the statistical reality here. Only a minuscule fraction of people suffering from severe mental illnesses are ever violent.
Right.
In fact, individuals with mental illness are significantly more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators.
Yeah, the dossier highlighted a specific study on this that completely upended my understanding of this whole thing. It was published in the journal Psychology, Public Policy, and Law.
That's a huge study.
Massive.
Yeah.
They analyzed the mental health histories of 176 mass shooters across a huge timeline from 1966 all the way to 2020. And they specifically looked for psychosis.
And just to clarify for everyone, psychosis being a literal clinical break from reality, hallucinations, profound delusions, and inability to perceive the real world.
Right, right. And the numbers regarding psychosis as a driving factor were shockingly low. In a half-century of data, psychosis was deemed to have played a major role in only 11% of the cases.
Just 11%.
A moderate role in 9% and a minor role in 11%.
Which means that in nearly 70% of these devastating events, a clinical break from reality was not even a minor contributing factor. The perpetrator was entirely grounded in reality. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Okay, so if they aren't psychotic, if they aren't hallucinating voices telling them to do this, what is the actual mechanism making them capable of it?
The clinical distinction here is between psychosis and psychopathy.
Psychosis versus psychopathy.
Psychosis is losing touch with reality. Psychopathy is losing touch with humanity.
Oh, wow.
Psychopathic traits involve a profound structural lack of empathy. It's a chilling callousness, a coldness, an absolute inability to feel the emotional weight of another person's suffering.
The source included a meta-analysis that really puts a number on that lack of empathy, which is wild. They looked at 22 different studies covering over 2,600 homicide offenders across 6 countries.
2,600.
Yeah, and they measured them on a standardized psychopathy scale.
The baseline comparison is what makes that study so illuminating. For an average person in the general, non-offending public, a normal score on this psychopathy scale is usually around a 4 or a 5.
Right, but the average homicide offender in that massive data set scored a 21.1.
21.1 compared to 4 or 5.
That isn't just a slight deviation. That is a massive psychological chasm. It tells us that these shooters aren't necessarily detached from reality. They are acting with a severe deficit in basic human empathy.
They understand the mechanics of the real world perfectly well. They simply do not possess the emotional hardware to care about the pain they are inflicting within it.
Okay, let me see if I can connect these dots. We have individuals who score incredibly high in psychopathy, meaning they lack empathy.
Yes.
We know they have these deeply unmet needs, specifically craving global recognition and twisted payback.
Right.
If they are firmly planted in reality, then something in the real world has to be giving them the blueprint for how to achieve that twisted fame. Yeah. It has to be the media they are consuming.
Absolutely. The media acts as a profound catalyst, creating what we know as the copycat effect. And a copycat crime doesn't mean they replicate a previous event perfectly.
Like a carbon copy.
No, instead, they use previous media reports like a menu. They might lift the specific tactical motivations, the type of weaponry used, the clothing, or the setting.
How common is it for them to actually use the media as a literal blueprint? Like, do we have numbers on that?
We do. In studies where researchers actually interview incarcerated criminals, 22% explicitly admitted that they committed a copycat crime.
22%.
And even more concerning, 20% stated they actively use media coverage of past crimes as a learning resource, a literal step-by-step how-to guide.
Wow. Is it kind of like when kids put on a Halloween mask? Like a kid who is normally shy puts on a scary mask, and suddenly they feel brave enough to jump out and scare people because they feel hidden behind this terrifying alter ego. Does consuming that media give them a mask to hide behind?
That's a great way to put it. The psychological term for that mechanism is depersonalization, and your analogy hits on exactly how it functions.
Depersonalization.
Yes. For someone already predisposed to violence, adopting the persona of a famous past shooter creates psychological distance. It lowers their natural human inhibitions against causing harm because they are playing a role.
They're acting out a script.
Exactly. And furthermore, the sensationalized media coverage reinforces the most dangerous unmet need we discussed: recognition. The blanket coverage teaches them a terrifying mathematical equation. The higher the body count, the greater the fame.
God, that's dark. Which brings us to, honestly, the most crucial part of this deep dive. What does all this mean for you, the listener?
Right.
We've analyzed the shooters, the psychopathy, the copycat mechanics. But how do you, as a regular person, process living in a world where these statistics are real? How do we handle the fallout?
We have to start by validating secondhand trauma. You do not have to be physically present at a tragedy to have your nervous system deeply affected by it.
That is so true.
The psychological fallout is vast. People experience profound mournfulness, intense anxiety about public spaces, and just crippling dread about the future.
The dossier also mentions a reaction that I think a lot of people feel guilty about, and that's numbness. Experiencing this strange out-of-body state where you read a horrific headline and you just feel nothing.
Right. And if you have experienced that numbness, you need to understand that it is a documented neurological coping mechanism. Your brain is a survival machine.
It's trying to protect you.
Exactly. When it is flooded with an overwhelming influx of horror that it cannot process, it essentially trips a circuit breaker to protect you. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, and feeling numb absolutely does not make you broken.
What really hit me hardest in the source material, though, was the mechanism of how this trauma impacts children. Even kids who are nowhere near an event are impacted through a sort of secondary exposure via their parents.
Trauma travels through family systems. The research shows that, for instance, mothers who are chronically exposed to news of gun violence experience significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression.
And the kids pick up on that.
Of course. That maternal depression then alters the environment of the home. It indirectly impacts the child's development, their attachment, and their baseline sense of safety in the world.
Which is why the actionable advice for parents in this dossier is so vital. Dr. Catherine Nguyen-Williams, a clinical psychologist who contributed to the Psychology Today dossier, wrote a line that just leveled me.
What did she say?
She wrote, "Parents don't need to be told how to talk to their children in the aftermath. They need to be told with truth and confidence that their children can go to school without being shot and killed while learning their fractions."
I mean, that perfectly articulates the deeply unfair, exhausting burden placed on modern parents.
It really does.
But because we have to navigate the world as it actually is, Dr. Williams outlines very specific, actionable steps for parenting in the wake of these events.
Okay, let's walk through those steps because this is the practical toolkit. The first step she outlines is to prepare before you speak to your kids.
Right. And the mechanism there is emotional contagion. Children are incredibly attuned to their parents' nervous systems.
They feel everything.
They do. If you try to talk to them while you are still processing your own raw, unfiltered terror, they will absorb your panic regardless of the words you actually use. You have to regulate your own emotions first so you can offer calm, authentic reassurance.
The second step is to ask open-ended questions. Don't assume you know what the child is actually afraid of.
Yes. You might start simply like, "Have you heard anything at school today about kids getting hurt?" And then you stop and you listen.
Don't fill in the blanks for them.
Exactly. If you start listing specific dangers, you might inadvertently introduce a new terror they hadn't even imagined yet. Let them guide the boundaries of the conversation.
Then there are the physical, environmental controls, like limiting their exposure to graphic news media and fiercely protecting their daily routines.
Routine is the physical proof to a child's brain that the world is still stable. And while you maintain that routine, you must actively monitor their bodies for stress.
Because they don't have the words for it.
Right. Young children rarely have the vocabulary to say, I am experiencing acute existential dread.
Yeah, of course not.
Instead, that trauma manifests physically. Look for unexplained, persistent stomach aches, tension headaches, sudden sleep regressions, or uncharacteristic behavioral outbursts.
The source also provides very specific advice on the transition back to school if a child is terrified. The instinct for a lot of parents might be the tough love approach,
Yeah.
like get right back on the horse, force them back into the classroom immediately so they don't develop a phobia. But the clinical advice is the exact opposite.
Oh, totally. Forcing a terrified child back into an environment they perceive as a threat only deepens the trauma response.
It makes it worse.
Much worse. The experts strongly advise easing them back in. Schools and parents need to collaborate to proactively create safe spaces, perhaps allowing the child to visit the school after hours or speaking with counselors so the child can express what they need to feel secure navigating those hallways again.
In the midst of all these heavy statistics and these dark psychological profiles, there is a fundamental truth we have to hold on to.
And that's the human capacity for resilience. The clinical data shows that the vast majority of people, including children, who are exposed to trauma or who experience acute symptoms after an event, do not go on to develop long-term mental health conditions like PTSD.
It is so hopeful.
It is. With robust support, open communication, and stable environments, children possess an incredible ability to heal.
That resilience is exactly what we want to leave you with today. We have covered a massive amount of ground. We look at the sheer scale of the statistics. We dismantled the incredibly common myth that these tragedies are simply the result of psychosis, and we uncovered the much darker mechanisms of psychopathy and thwarted psychological needs.
We covered a lot.
We really did. We explored how sensationalized media provides a blueprint for copycats seeking infamy. And most importantly, we broke down the clinical steps to protect your kids and your own mental health by validating your numbness, securing their routines, and having prepared, honest conversations. Understanding the mechanics of these psychological fractures gives us at least a small foothold of control in a landscape that often feels completely out of our hands.
And as we wrap up, there's one final provocative thought pulled from the essential reading list in the source material that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
I want you to sit with this question long after this deep dive ends. Extensive psychological research suggests that fear, masculinity, and social norms are the primary drivers fueling U.S. gun culture.
Okay.
If we accept that data, if those are the true psychological fault lines building the pressure, what would happen if we fundamentally shifted our entire approach to prevention?
What do you mean?
Well, what if instead of continually investing millions of dollars into bulletproof whiteboards and tactical gear for elementary school teachers, we recognized a completely different kind of armor?
Like what?
What if radical kindness, robust social emotional support, and community intervention are actually our strongest, most effective shields against violence? If we can learn to fix the cracks in the foundation before the pressure becomes terminal, maybe the ground doesn't have to break at all.
That is a really powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this heavy but deeply necessary deep dive. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.